Henry Cavill is making a 40k television show and/or movie, and I am as excited as a baby boy on Christmas morning who hears a rattling in the chimney. But it is yet to be determined whether it's Santa Claus or his East German cousin currently shimmying down the chimney. As any 40k TV show and/or movie is going to have a plethora of landmines placed in its way long before it actually makes it to a screen near you. A fact well documented by the half a dozen or so failed attempt to do this in the past, in addition to, of course, Ultramarines. And the currently ongoing disaster that is Warhammer Plus, whose only real claim to fame and quality at the moment are the YouTube animators they threatened into joining them, or they'd sue them. And better still, once the animators are locked away in the GW dungeons, they're also slapped with one of the worst contracts I have actually ever seen, including a 36-month non-disclosure and non-compete policy. Oh yes, never ever forget that GW really actually is a very, very, very bad company. And now allied with Amazon is probably going to do its level best to ruin any 40k television show. So, in the name of moderating expectations, let us look at the largest problems that Henry Cavill might be facing if he is really serious about making good 40k entertainment. Starting with the biggest and probably the most unavoidable problem, pitching it to the normies. Meaning that GW is going to try and water down 40k in order to appeal to that mythical wider audience. GW has been quite desperately at times trying to make it mainstream now for the last, 10 plus years really, and their efforts have only gotten more desperate as time has gone on. Don't get me wrong, some of their efforts haven't been all bad. For example, the big toy figurines are pretty neato cheeto, but the $50 bathrobes... or, God help me, the Magic the Gathering collaboration are some cringe-ass shit, and not very 40k in the slightest. This watering down of the franchise has been quite a problem for quite some time now, and nothing symbolizes it more than the Primaris Space Marines, which seems to be the only faction that GW is actually releasing these days, to the point that you could build an entire army of Primaris lieutenants and not have a single duplicate figure in it. In fact, it's gotten so ridiculous that even GW have made the joke about the Primaris lieutenants with the top 20 Primaris lieutenants lists on their official community page. And this was in 2020. It's gotten worse since then, difficult though that may be to imagine. Now, my hatred of the Primaris Marines is a well-documented fact. I despise how they look, I hate their lore, and I consider Belisario's call to be one of the largest insults to any established franchise since, well, Disney, let's be fair here. There are limits that even GW haven't crossed just yet. As the Primaris Marine took all of the cool parts about the Space Marines, the feel of Knights Templars in space, and turned them into rounded, tactical, generic modern-day super soldiers. But the Space Marines have always been GW's poster boys, and clearly the temptation to simply sell all of the Space Marines a second time was too much to resist, and they are here now to stay. Really, the only question is how long we even get to keep the old school Marines at all. But doom and gloom aside, it is, in my opinion, no need to pitch 40k to the normies, as I remain wholly convinced that there is no such thing as the wider audience. There are simply successful products and there are unsuccessful products. Diluting the thing that made the product popular in the first place is going to achieve nothing but a slow and drawn-out death. A quick glance over the wrung-dry corpse of Star Wars is all you need to fully affirm that theory. And sure, there will be an initial audience for a 40k TV show, no matter what. Us true fans of GW's long-standing abuse have grown quite accustomed to the bruises, and rather skilled at applying foundation. Anyone willing to pay $8 for a teaspoon of paint? I wish I was joking, by the way. Already has a fairly elevated pain threshold, after all, but it only works for so long. The damage a bad show inflicts to a franchise reputation is infinitely more important than any short-term monetary gains. Again, even Baby Yoda, a character created solely to sell plushies, has bounced off the ceiling of mediocre merchandise marketing and begun to fail. Which is quite impressive in and of itself, as Disney has managed to turn the literal royalty of toydom into a second-rate entity. And 40k does not have the kind of sales cred that Star Wars once commanded. It needs its dedicated fan core to spread the word and turn a relatively obscure, on the borderline of mainstream for 10 plus years property like Warhammer into a genuine big hit. Although admittedly, perhaps it would be better for everyone involved if it remained obscure. As God knows, there are plenty of examples of good franchises turning rotten once it finally enters that mainstream, and then attributing that success specifically to the dilution of their franchise. But correlation does not always mean causation, as my go-to example of this is, of course, Creative Assembly's Total War series, whom, with the release of Total War Warhammer, had their biggest success ever, and then said, well, this is a way more simplistic game than our previous titles, so clearly people like simplicity. Instead of looking at the actual reason, which we can see with Rome 2, for example. Rome 2 on launch was an absolutely awful, broken mess of a video game that would have sunk any company with a lesser track record than Creative Assembly. But it was still an enormous financial success despite being a broken piece of garbage. Was that because it was more simplistic? No, it was because of Rome Total War 1 and Medieval 2 Total War. The word of mouth and the good faith of previous franchises and the quality of previous entries was what made these newer games popular. Not that they were more aimed towards the normies, it was simply that more of the normies had heard of the game via the old school fans. But this is a tree that I and many others have been barking up the last half-decade, and for some reason, I doubt GW will be the first company to actually listen. So the point is, Games Workshop is going to want to pitch this property to the widest possible audience, to the normiest of the normies. That means they're going to want a watered-down setting, they are going to want the absolute baseline, and they are going to want their poster childs as well. That means Primaris, and that means Ultramarines. Which in turn means a united fandom will turn towards it and shout, "Vanilla!" at the top of their lungs, and it probably will be as well. Now, that does not automatically mean disaster, mind you, but it does almost certainly mean it will be mediocre. You could do something like Uriel Ventris, for example, the Ultramarine series, but ironically that has some shit that's probably a bit too spicy for a current year television series. Anyone who knows what Demon Collaba means will understand perfectly. And so, if I were to be pessimistic, I would probably say that the most likely thing we are going to see is Henry Cavill as some original character ultramarine, written by one of the prolific and ever-present Black Library authors, venturing off on a completely inoffensive and bland, predictable, and frankly uninteresting adventure to save some human settlement somewhere against evil aliens. And hey, at the end of the day, this doesn't need to be a bad story, but in all due likelihood, it's simply going to be another Ultramarines, a painfully predictable and not particularly interesting entry in the 40k mythos. And, as we mention authors, that is going to be problem number 2. There is going to be a lot of pressure internally from GW and Black Library, their novel writing arm, to see one of their big-name authors on the credits scroll. Why is that a problem, you ask? Surely that's great, right? They've got a bunch of good authors. They'll guarantee a good story, right? Well, the problem is, whilst the likes of Dan Abnett and Graham McNeill are great book writers, no question, they have no talent for interactive media. Dan Abnett, in particular, the poster boy of Black Library, has written a ton of stories for games, and they have nearly invariably been awful. In fact, thinking of it, I don't think I can recall a single one that was actually all that good. So, no, they've all invariably been awful to mediocre. He also has previously tried his hands at movie scripts with Ultramarines. The much lambasted movie throughout this little video here. Movie, again, like, if you haven't watched it, its only truly memorable feature is how awful its CGI looks. Which you should know by now, as I imagine I'll have tortured you with a copious quantity of it throughout this video again. And for many of the others, like Graham McNeill for example, they have as many hits as they have misses these days. It was Graham McNeill, for example, that penned The Reflection Cracked. A book that brings about strong emotions in me. The single worst, most damaging, and expectation-subverting book in the current-day Hollywood way, and mean piece of fluff in the history of Warhammer. That short story caused more harm to the Horus Heresy series than the End Times did to Warhammer Fantasy, or the Master of Mankind did to the Emperor. That book is the rough equivalent of being flayed alive across a carpet of crushed glass and cum-stained tissue paper. And speaking of that work of literary defamation that I mentioned a second ago there to the Master of Mankind, my blood pressure is already rising. Another problem Black Library authors have is that they often tend to force their own canon onto the audience regardless of whether it makes sense or enhances the setting. The Reflection Cracked is of course one example of that, of a criminal act in that regard, and the God Emperor, or the Master of Mankind, is... He is the poster boy example of this. Aaron Dembski Bowden, the Master of Mankind's author, reduced and undermined the character of the Emperor in damn near every single solitary way, and starts what appears to be Games Workshop's quest to turn the God Emperor from one of the most badass and identifiable characters in fictional history to an incompetent bipolar moron who makes decisions based apparently on random chance and how retarded he's feeling at the time. In the Horus Heresy, the book series, the God Emperor fluctuates wildly between all-seeing, omniscient God with a 10,000-year master plan to a paint-huffing, amnesic absentee father with severe frontal lobe damage. This is a topic that gets me a little bit heated, because I don't like it when people try to ruin my things on purpose. And in the case of Adam Dembski Bowden, That is absolutely the case. Bowden writes fantastic Chaos characters because he is an enormous Chaos fanboy, and which is why he should be kept 1,000 miles away from any loyalist storyline on penalty of castration. Because he hates loyalists, and he will do everything in his power to ruin them. But essentially, the thing is, the Horus Heresy was too ambitious for GW to try and pull off, and every single character suffers badly to some degree or another from the too many chefs in the kitchen disorder. The Deflection Cracked is simply the single worst offender, but there is also Horus, for example, turning from beneficent and perfect leader to son-murdering maniacal maniac in the turn of a page, or Petirabo, who has 3 distinct personalities throughout his various books. Listen, I'm not saying this from a position of hatred or anything like that. I have entire shelves stuffed with Black Library books. I used to love the shit out of them. I have even bought the ridiculously expensive special collector's edition of the Horus Heresy source books, hoping that they would be more Imperial armor. Another series I absolutely adore, and I think these authors are great. But they have their strengths and they have their weaknesses like everyone else, and they do not overlap well with one another, or a television show. And if 2022 has taught us anything, it is that bad writing can really be the death knell of damn near any television show. If it was capable of murdering the Lord of the Rings, it is certainly more than able to put a 40k show out of everybody's misery awfully quickly. And so this show needs to look for talent other than the established 40k writers. I even heard that apparently those guys who make those hilarious little cartoons, Flash Kits, sent in their resume as well, and whilst I don't think their style of entertainment would quite fit in with the average 40k television show, I do suspect they probably would do a better job than these established authors. So, Cavill, consider it. And whilst we're on the topic of hiring decisions, the biggest and potentially nastiest bump in the road for any TV show is, of course, the politics. It may be 2023, but you're not going to get away from the current year just yet, as we're still a good old while before the wheel truly turns, and Amazon is one of those holdouts that still has diversity, representation, and inclusion clauses in their actual contracts, and as a part of their company policy. That did wonders for the Rings of Power, of course. And I'm sure it'll do just wonderfully here as well, because, well, no matter how you flip and switch this bitch, you are not getting away from the fact that it is, in fact, the current year. And 40k, like damn near every other franchise, is getting invaded by fair weather friends and hobby tourists. And those are the benign sorts of cancer, in comparison to those who simply wish to hoist their flag on top of their hobby. And GW has been surrendering to these groups for quite some time now, to the point of disowning their own produced material, as in the Liber Chaotica, and also disowning the Imperium as an entity, because somebody showed up to a tournament calling himself the Austrian Painter. And we all know so painfully well what surrendering to these people will do. Hell, The Witcher Blood Origin has... I guess that's the newest, bestest example, isn't it? Like I said in my Fantasy is Dead video, all fantasy has simply been reduced to the current year's representation now. Every fantasy setting is the exact same collage of skin colors and genders, rather than being representative of a fantasy setting. And always for the same exact reason. to claim ground in the hobby, in the setting, in the franchise, in the books, whatever, for their own political agenda. These people do not view 40k as a reprieve from the real world, or a good game or a deep universe, but simply more ground to be captured in their crusade. And they are willing to pretend to be damn near anything to gain that ground. Let us, for example, take a look at one of the more widely known long scams in gaming. Polygon. This is a gaming site which is quite infamous in online circles for being perhaps the worst of all the gaming journalist websites in history, in parts due to its legendarily bad first look at Doom back in 2016. Let me just roll this shit in the background right here to remind you, just in case you forgot why games journalist is a literal curse word today. And also, because it exemplifies what I am talking about so very, very well. This guy right here, who's playing this game, who's been given exclusive access to a major title, Doom, by Bethesda, before anyone else, he finds turning and moving at the same time challenging. He has about the same grasp of first-person shooter theory as your average blind grandmother does. He literally, the dude can't aim. I'm not even going to describe it. I'm simply just going to show it. This guy has zero interest in the game, in the genre, that it is his job to play and review. How does that happen? How does that even happen? Why on the God Emperor's good green earth would such a person pick up a mouse and keyboard for any reason besides trying to ram it up their own sphincter? It is because Polygon, of course, as we have gone over so many times, their priority is not gaming, and it never has been. Polygon's priority is politics, and always will be. It is their greater good, their immoral obsession, and by definition, nothing can ever be more important than the greater good. And now, since it is starting to become popular, they have, all of a sudden, become very interested in 40k. Shock and surprise. And equally surprising is the angle they're taking. Political, of course. Welcome to Warhammer 40k's anti-fascist future. And by fascist, they mean everyone who is not wearing a full-body LGBTQ fursuit. And of course, it is based on the Warhammer is for Everyone post, which I have lambasted often for its obvious ridiculousness. Namely, that the entire point of it is to say, hey, Warhammer is for everyone, but only if you agree with us. And as I say every time, Warhammer never excluded anyone. At any point, there was never a sign in the store window saying no blacks, gays, Asians, allowed. Never. It didn't happen. There was zero exclusion in the Warhammer community until the left moved in and suddenly, voila! If you don't agree, you will not be missed. This is not a mystery. This isn't 6 or 7 years ago when we didn't know what the agenda was about. We all know now. It is old hat. And yet, we are going to have to deal with it for a couple years more at least. To the point where, of course, you've got comments like this from one guy simply saying, hey, I think your community comes together with a shared passion for cool shit. Wow. Weird. And Warhammer responds simply by saying, no, you're wrong. They don't come together for passion of cool shit, you see. They come together for political virtue signaling. They come together to say that love and kindness are good things. That is what is important to the Warhammer community. A expressly grimdark setting, but hey, details. Now, Henry Cavill should, as a 40k fan, be ideally placed to, well, put 40k first over political concerns. Cavill also certainly does not strike me as much of a modern-day progressive, but who knows? He has been very careful to keep his mouth shut on any and all controversial issues, which is a wise move, incidentally, as here's the thing. Amazon already have their diversity and inclusion policies. It is part of their official company agenda. GW has for many years resisted the calls to include representation and yada yada in their own company agenda, in fact going so far as to specifically state that they are not going to do so. Not out of any real ideological resistance, mind you, but simply because GW has not fallen completely yet. And it is in large part their Warhammer community team, their PR team, that is pushing a lot of this, and a lot of it is also coming from Black Library. I've got a couple birds on the inside of GW that have informed me as much, even to the point that when the Warhammer for Everyone post was released, a lot of the leadership did not expect the amount of backlash that they got, and chastised the community team over it, even as they realized that they couldn't pull it down now, as they would simply just get fired upon from both sides, though, well, DW isn't doing enough for the progressive side, and so they are going to be taking fire from both sides regardless, because, of course, it is never good enough. And no matter how loudly GW virtue signals, they will still be accused of all the things they were always going to be accused of. So how to get around this particular problem then? Because it is a problem. If Amazon moves in with its diversity policy, what happened to the Rings of Power? What happened to Blood Origins? What happened to every other diverse flop the last few years will happen to 40k, because the focus will be moved away from making a 40k show and towards making a political virtue signal, representing downtown Los Angeles rather than the 41st millennium. And the fans are not going to like it. The casual audience don't like it. Nobody seems to like it. At the same time, however, it is not yet possible for somebody to simply make a stand against it and say, no, we're not going to do it. Amazon has in all due likelihood already clarified this in their contractual agreements with GW, though bearing in mind no official purchase, as far as I'm aware, has actually been made yet. All of this is still in the theory crafting and negotiation phase, last I heard, but we'll have to wait and see how it shakes out in that regard. The best thing that somebody in Henry Cavill's position can do is to try and move as much of the focus as possible back on to 40k, which is not impossible even with a little bit of diversity here and there. If you can, for example, get somebody... Think Disa from the Rings of Power. She actually did a damn good job as the Dwarven Princess, to the point where I would actually be happy to believe that she was the best person for the job if they had simply glued a bloody beard onto her. Because after seeing how well she fit in the role, I am no longer annoyed by her skin color. I am annoyed by the fact that the Rings of Power did not put in the minimum effort required to make her look like a dwarf, as they are clearly stated in Tolkien's lore to all have beards, regardless of gender. Meaning that in all due likelihood, she was simply a diversity hire that turned out to be pretty alright. In contrast to the Black Elf, for example, whose singular facial expression grows a wee bit tiresome after a while. I also know that a lot of people, you subscribers included, have urged the more conservative elements of the 40k fandom to try and get in contact with the Cavill to offer their services, and I actually don't think that's a very good idea yet. Because here's the thing, if Cavill were to be seen in public with almost any member of the current online Warhammer community, he's going to get attacked for it. almost regardless. Every single one has some dirty laundry, and considering the oft-displayed jealousy of aforementioned community, I very much so doubt drama will not ensue. Cavill's best option is to remain what he has been so far, studiedly neutral. And once he is eventually in a position of actual power and influence, after having made a successful show and thus become indispensable because if they fire him, the show loses all credibility, then perhaps he can make a push for a little bit more diversity of thought rather than merely of pigmentation. And this leads me to the final problem, which Amazon might be able to solve, namely the cost. This is one of the big issues that kind of leads back to GW's desire to reach the wider audience again. Because you can actually do a 40k show pretty goddamn cheaply, honestly. Something along the lines of, Cypher's Kane would not be the greatest example because he does fight a fair bit of monsters like, ambles and orcs and tyranids, etc. But you could easily enough do a story of an Imperial Guard regiment fighting against chaos. You could do Krieg, for example. Honestly, that one would be pretty simple. Now, you would probably have to get a decent movie set with something along the lines of a bunker or something like that. I believe there actually are bunkers still on the beaches of Normandy that people keep using for movie scenes like this. But that would probably be your biggest single expense. Some way of showing the large attacks. And there's all kinds of software to do that. Plus, GW does have plenty of animators right now that are working away in the dungeons. They could be put to good use. Alternatively, you can simply do a nice, simple, original story of a bunch of Imperial Guardsmen behind enemy lines, perhaps. Take inspiration from the likes of Band of Brothers or Generation Kill, maybe. A look at the real life of the Imperial Guard could be really fascinating in a low-intensity environment. Absolutely. But again, let's be honest here, GW is going to want to show off their poster boys in all due likelihood, which means we're gonna need some 2 meters tall power armor. Which, weirdly enough, doesn't really grow on trees. The best option they've got here is practical effects, making an actual suit of powered armor, which people have done for conventions, etc. They don't necessarily look perfect, but they look good enough. Alternatively, they could go the Iron Man approach of a full CGI suit, but the issue is that shit is really, really goddamn expensive. And if Marvel is looking at the price tag and squinting just a little bit, GW is gonna have a very hard time. They could also go the fully animated approach, but that shit is even more expensive. Plus, if you've got Henry Cavill as an actor, geek Jesus, if you don't put him in an on-camera role, I will seriously start questioning GW's sanity at that point. Perhaps a better option would be to simply limit the number of Space Marines. Take, again, like I mentioned in my top 5 roles, Ragnar Blackmane. I think Cavill would do a pretty damn good Ragnar, and have him do his little fuck-up and get sent off to Terra. I believe there was only like another 4 or 5 Wolf Brothers on Terra, I think, and then do some good old-fashioned intrigue on Terra. There you are. That will certainly be good enough for a TV show. You can also then focus primarily on Ragnar as he's growing up earlier, undergoing his training. More of a historical fantasy style setting rather than the over-the-topness of 40k, with a relatively limited number of Space Marine characters. That could work. And by God, do not do the Horus Heresy. Again, they don't have enough money. Even if Amazon, for some reason, was willing to pour in hundreds of millions, like they did with the Rings of Power, into the Horus Heresy, which, bear you in mind as well, is a pretty damn limited setting as far as, full knowledge is concerned, it simply wouldn't be as weighty. People need a relationship with 40k before they can see Horus Lupercal on screen and go, wow, Horus, regardless of what they choose to do, the price tag is going to be an issue. Again, Amazon can undoubtedly solve a lot of that, but GW, well, it's a profitable company, but it's not that profitable of a company. And bear you in mind as well that it has already sunk a lot of money into Warhammer Plus, which in all due likelihood, it is not getting back. It has been appealing to Hasbro to buy it, GW that is, for a very long time now, and Hasbro is still not biting. This after Hasbro a few years ago basically stated that nah, GW just simply isn't profitable enough for them, which is a lot of the reason why GW has been so aggressively monetizing their IP as of late. Though, bear in mind, this could also mean that they'll go the completely other direction. The leadership of GW might think to itself, okay, we've got Amazon on board, maybe at least. We are actually going to go for broke. We are going to pour everything we've got in this. We're going to throw the kitchen sink in and our entire development department. We are going to sink ourselves if this doesn't work, but if it does, we'll get bought out. Amazon will sweep on in, lift us off our feet, and carry us off to wealth and glory for all the future to come. Possibly. In fact, not entirely impossible. Amazon does have a lot of money and is quite fond of making acquisitions, certainly. But after Rings of Power, I wonder how eager Amazon's investors will be to engage in another massive expense. So I suspect it is going to be up to Cavill and his team to do a lot more with a lot less. And if this was the fandom of half a decade ago, the fandom that eagerly cheered on any and all fan creations, the fandom that was just overjoyed at any sort of fan content whatsoever, then I think they could have gotten away with it almost no matter what, so long as it was 40k. But today, after GW has deliberately taken away that fan creation community, I think the expectations are going to be justifiably higher than before. And now, with your expectations suitably adjusted, I would also like to ask all of you to tell me what you think are going to be the biggest problems in a 40k television show, and how they might be solved. Personally, I do think these are the biggest ones. Pitching it to the normies, the authors, the politics, and the cost of it all. As many of these are also going to, make each other more difficult. You're not going to get Amazon on board for the costs unless you embrace their politics. And you're probably not going to get Amazon on board either unless you promise some big budget names. Henry Cavill is going to be one of them, but who's going to write the script? And in swing Dan Abnett again with his less than stellar track record. Again, don't get me wrong, I love Dan Abnett's writing, but he has yet to do anything particularly great in gaming or in the case of movies. I'd like to point out he wrote the story for Darktide, amongst other things. A story that basically consists of, hey, you, the recruit who killed 500 cultists on your first mission. You're kind of shit at what you do. If you don't kill 2,000 next time, I'm not even going to speak to you. And then throws you out of the Strategium. That's it's almost too highbrow level of writing for me, frankly. And we can then just cross our fingers and pray and hope that there will actually be something good produced for 40k for once. As these days, well, half the time I almost hope for a flop, as is in the case of the Rings of Power, for example, but this, I just can't bring myself to root for the defeat of a 40k television show run by Henry Cavill. That is just too interesting of a prospect to ignore. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.